The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor, each droplet catching the city lights of Manhattan as it cascaded down. Marcus Blackwood sat behind his mahogany desk, his fingers tracing the embossed edges of documents he couldn't see, but whose contents he knew by heart. The financial reports painted a picture darker than the storm clouds gathering outside his penthouse office. "Mr. Blackwood, the board meeting has been moved to tomorrow morning." His assistant Rebecca's voice filtered through the intercom, cutting through his contemplation. Marcus pressed his fingertips together, a gesture that had become second nature since the accident. 15 years ago had stolen his sight, but sharpened every other sense. He could hear the hesitation in Rebecca's voice, the slight tremor that betrayed her nervousness about tomorrow's meeting. The scandal surrounding Blackwood Industries had reached a crescendo, and the board was demanding answers he wasn't sure he could provide. The empire his grandfather had built from nothing, brick by brick, deal by deal, now teetered on the edge of collapse. What had started as whispers about questionable land acquisitions had grown into a full-blown investigation by federal authorities. The media had latched onto the story like vultures, painting him as the privileged heir who had inherited his grandfather's sins along with his billions. Marcus stood and walked to the window, his hand finding the cool glass. Through his fingertips, he could feel the vibrations of the city below, the pulse of millions of lives, each person dealing with their own struggles. But his struggle was different. His blindness had taught him to read people in ways that sight never could. He could detect lies in the subtle changes of breathing patterns, fear in the quickening of heartbeats, and desperation in the tremor of voices. That's how he knew Rebecca was hiding something. "Rebecca, come in here," he called, out, turning back toward his desk. The door opened with its familiar soft click, and he heard her measured footsteps approach. She'd been with him for 3 years, long enough to know his routines, but not long enough to completely mask her emotions from his heightened senses. "Sir, I need to discuss something with you," she began, her voice carrying that same nervous tremor he detected earlier. "The reports about Senator Williams pulling his support?" Marcus asked, settling back into his chair. "Among other things, yes." Rebecca placed what sounded like a thick folder on his desk. "But there's something else. I've been contacted by someone who might be able to help with the situation." Marcus raised an eyebrow. In the 3 years Rebecca had worked for him, she'd never been this cryptic. "Go on." "It's unconventional, but given the circumstances..." She paused, and Marcus could hear her shifting uncomfortably in her chair. "The person suggested that what you need right now is to change the narrative. Instead of being seen as the isolated billionaire bachelor with a questionable family history, you need to be seen as a stable, committed family man." "And how exactly do they propose I accomplish this transformation?" Marcus asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew where this conversation was heading. "A marriage of convenience," Rebecca said quickly, as if saying it fast would make it less shocking. "To someone with no connections to your world, someone who would be willing to play the role of the devoted wife for a substantial financial compensation." Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing the suggestion. It wasn't entirely without merit. The public loved a good love story, and a happily married Marcus Blackwood would certainly be more sympathetic than the current version the media had painted. But the idea of bringing someone else into this mess, of involving an innocent person in the web of complications his life had become, didn't sit well with him. "And I suppose this mysterious contact has someone in mind?" he asked. "Actually, yes, her name is Elena Rodriguez. She's a translator and language instructor, currently experiencing some financial difficulties. She has no criminal background, no political affiliations, and no social media presence to speak of. She's essentially invisible, which makes her perfect for this arrangement." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the proposal. The logical part of his mind recognized the potential benefits. A marriage would indeed change the public narrative, and if it was handled correctly, it could buy him the time he needed to clear his family's name and restructure the company. But another part of him, a part he usually kept buried deep, recoiled at the idea of such a calculated arrangement. "Where did you find her?" he asked finally. She responded to a very discreet job posting. The advertisement was vague, just mentioning a position that required discretion and would involve significant travel and public appearances. She needs the money, Mr. Blackwood, desperately. Marcus stood and walked to his private bar, pouring himself 2 fingers of scotch. The amber liquid caught the light from the city below. As he swirled it in the glass, what kind of financial difficulties? The type that comes from having no family support system and multiple jobs that barely cover basic expenses. She lives in a studio apartment in Queens, takes the subway everywhere, and hasn't taken a vacation in over 5 years. She's exactly the kind of person who would agree to this arrangement without asking too many questions. And what makes you think she'd agree to marry a stranger? Rebecca's pause was telling. Because I've already spoken with her. Preliminary conversations only, of course. I presented it as a potential opportunity, and while she was initially skeptical, she didn't immediately refuse. I think with the right offer, she could be convinced. Marcus took a sip of his scotch, feeling the burn as it went down. The rain continued to pound against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the wail of sirens. The eternal soundtrack of the city that never slept. Set up a meeting, he said finally. Sir, if I'm going to enter into this arrangement, I want to meet her first. I need to be able to trust that she can handle what this will entail. The media attention, the scrutiny, the public appearances, it won't be easy. Of course, I'll arrange something discreet. Perhaps the private dining room at the plaza. No, Marcus shook his head. Somewhere more neutral. Somewhere she'll feel comfortable. I don't want to intimidate her before I've even met her. Rebecca made a note. I'll find something appropriate. When would you like to meet her? Marcus walked back to his desk, his fingers finding the financial reports once again. The numbers hadn't changed in the 15 minutes since he'd last reviewed them, but somehow they felt even more damning now. The investigation was closing in, and he could feel the walls of his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. Tomorrow evening, he said, after the board meeting, I'll either be celebrating a victory or planning damage control. Either way, I'll know exactly what I'm asking her to walk into. Understood, I'll make the arrangements. As Rebecca gathered her papers and prepared to leave, Marcus called out to her. Rebecca, this Elena Rodriguez, what's your read on her, your honest assessment? Rebecca paused at the door. She's proud, Mr. Blackwood. Proud enough that accepting charity would probably be harder for her than accepting a business arrangement. She's intelligent, well-educated, and despite her current circumstances, she carries herself with dignity. I think she might surprise you. After Rebecca left, Marcus remained alone in his office, the city lights creating patterns. He couldn't see but could somehow feel. The proposal was risky, potentially disastrous if it went wrong. But as he sat there listening to the storm rage outside, he realized that he was already living in a disaster. Perhaps it was time to try something different. He thought about Elena Rodriguez, this woman he'd never met but who might become his wife. What kind of desperation drove someone to consider marrying a complete stranger? What kind of life had she lived that made such an arrangement seem like a viable option? Tomorrow, he would find out. Tomorrow, he would meet the woman who might help him save everything he'd worked to build, or who might become another casualty in the ongoing destruction of the Blackwood legacy. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean, while Marcus Blackwood sat in his tower, preparing to make a deal that would change both their lives forever. Elena Rodriguez smoothed her black pencil skirt for the 3rd time as she sat in the small cafe in Midtown, her fingers drumming nervously against the ceramic mug of coffee that had long since grown cold. She'd chosen her most professional outfit, a simple black suit she'd bought second-hand, but had tailored to fit perfectly, hoping to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. The conversation with Rebecca Hartwell had been surreal. A marriage of convenience to one of New York's most powerful men wasn't exactly the type of job opportunity she'd expected when she'd responded to that vague posting online. But as she sat there, reviewing her bank account balance on her phone for the 10th time that day, the impossible was starting to seem merely impractical. Her rent was 3 months overdue, Her student loans were in default, and the freelance translation work that had been keeping her afloat had dried up almost completely. The language school where she taught part-time had cut her hours, and her other part-time job at the bookstore barely covered groceries. She was drowning, and this bizarre proposition felt like someone had thrown her a life preserver. The bell above the cafe door chimed, and Elena looked up to see a tall man in an impeccably tailored dark suit enter, followed by a woman she recognized as Rebecca. But it was the man who commanded attention, not just because of his obvious wealth and status, but because of the way he moved. His movements were deliberate, confident, and there was something about the way he tilted his head slightly, as if listening to sounds others couldn't hear. Marcus. Blackwood was younger than she'd expected, probably in his mid-30s with dark hair and sharp features. When he turned in her direction, she noticed his eyes. They were focused somewhere just past her, and it was then that she realized he was blind. Rebecca had mentioned it in passing, but seeing it in person was different. There was no pity in Elena's reaction, only curiosity about how he navigated the world with such apparent confidence. Rebecca guided him to Elena's table, and as he approached, Elena found herself studying his face. Even without being able to see her, there was something about his presence that made her feel as though she was being evaluated, measured, understood in ways that made her uncomfortable. "Ms. Rodriguez," Marcus said as he reached the table, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't quite place, perhaps a trace of his grandfather's European origins. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "Mr. Blackwood," Elena replied, standing to shake his offered hand. His grip was firm, confident, and lingered just a moment longer than necessary. "Please, call me Elena." "Marcus," he replied, settling into the chair across from her with fluid grace. Rebecca took a seat at a nearby table, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough to provide the illusion of privacy. For a moment, they sat in silence, and Elena found herself studying his face, looking for some indication of what he was thinking. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was something about the set of his jaw that suggested he was as uncomfortable with this meeting as she was. "I assume Rebecca has explained the unusual nature of this arrangement," Marcus began, his fingers finding the handle of the coffee cup Rebecca had placed before him. "She has," Elena replied carefully. "Though I have to admit, it's not exactly what I was expecting when I applied for a position requiring discretion and public appearances." A ghost of a smile crossed Marcus's lips. "I imagine not. Let me be direct, Elena. I need a wife. Not for love, not for companionship, but for appearance. My company is under scrutiny, and my personal life has become part of the public narrative in ways that are damaging to both my business and my employees' livelihoods." Elena appreciated his directness, even as the bluntness of his words stung slightly. "And you think a wife will solve that problem?" "I think a stable, committed relationship will change the conversation. Instead of being the reclusive billionaire with questionable family connections, I become the devoted husband who's working to right past wrongs." Marcus paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "The arrangement would be temporary, 2 years maximum. You would receive a substantial financial compensation, health insurance, and a generous settlement at the end of our agreement." "How substantial?" Elena asked, deciding that if they were being direct, she might as well address the practical aspects. $500,000 for the 2-year commitment, plus all living expenses, a clothing allowance, and a bonus based on how successfully we maintain the public facade. Marcus's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing a business contract rather than a marriage. Elena's breath caught. $500,000 would not only solve all her financial problems, but would give her the security she'd never had. She could pay off her student loans, help her elderly neighbor Mrs. Chen with her medical bills, maybe even start the translation business she'd always dreamed of. "And what exactly would be expected of me?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Public appearances as my wife, charity events, business dinners, social functions. We would maintain separate residences initially, though we'd need to spend time together to make the relationship appear genuine. Media interviews if necessary, and absolute discretion about the nature of our arrangement." Elena nodded slowly, processing the information. And the personal aspects of the marriage? Marcus's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. This would be strictly professional. We would share public spaces when necessary, but our private lives would remain separate. I'm not looking for intimacy, Elena. I'm looking for a business partner who happens to wear a wedding ring. Something about the way he said it, the careful distance he maintained even in his tone, made Elena wonder what had happened to make him so guarded. But she pushed the thought aside. His personal issues weren't her concern. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. I need to think about it, Elena said finally. Of course, but I should mention that time is somewhat of a factor. The media attention isn't going to diminish, and I need to change the narrative sooner rather than later. Elena studied his face, looking for some hint of the man behind the careful facade. Can I ask you something? Marcus tilted his head slightly, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as his way of focusing completely on what someone was saying. Of course. Why me? Surely there are women in your social circle who would be more suitable for this kind of arrangement, women who already understand that world. For the first time since he'd sat down, Marcus's carefully controlled expression showed a crack of something genuine. Because someone from my world would have their own agenda, their own connections, their own reasons for agreeing that might complicate the arrangement. You need this opportunity, and I need someone who will fulfill their part of the agreement without trying to turn it into something it's not. You mean someone desperate enough to agree to marry a stranger, Eleanor said quietly. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said finally, I suppose that's exactly what I mean. His honesty, brutal as it was, somehow made Elena respect him more than if he'd tried to dress it up in prettier language. At least he wasn't lying to her about what this was. How long do I have to decide, she asked. 48 hours. If you agree, we'll need to move quickly, a whirlwind romance followed by a small, intimate wedding. The media will eat it up, especially if we sell it as love at first sight overcoming all obstacles. Elena almost laughed at the irony. Love at first sight with a man who couldn't actually see her and who was offering her $500,000 to pretend to love him. But as she looked at Marcus Blackwood, really looked at him, she realized there was more to this man than the cold businessman he presented to the world. I'll give you an answer by Friday, she said, standing to leave. Marcus stood as well, extending his hand once again. Thank you for considering it, Elena. I know it's an unusual request. As they shook hands, Elena found herself wondering what his story really was. What had happened to make him so isolated, so willing to pay someone to pretend to care about him? And more importantly, what was she getting herself into if she said yes? Mr. Blackwood, she said as she gathered her purse, if I agree to this arrangement, I have one condition of my own, which is honesty. If we're going to convince the world we're in love, we need to at least be honest with each other about everything else. I won't be kept in the dark about what I'm walking into. Something shifted in Marcus's expression, and for a moment Eleanor thought she saw a flicker of something that might have been regret. Agreed, he said quietly. Complete honesty. As Eleanor walked out of the cafe and into the bustling streets of Manhattan, she couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus Blackwood was harboring secrets that went far deeper than a simple business scandal. But with her rent notice burning a hole in her purse and her bank account showing a balance that made her stomach clench with anxiety, she knew she was going to say yes. She just hoped that honesty would prove to be as simple as he'd made it sound. 3 weeks had passed since Elena Rodriguez became Elena Blackwood in a small ceremony at City Hall, witnessed only by Rebecca and Marcus's lawyer. The media had indeed eaten up the story of the whirlwind romance, though Elena still felt like she was playing a character rather than living her own life. Now, as she stood in the living room of Marcus's penthouse overlooking Central Park, she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she'd agreed to. The apartment was a testament to understated luxury. Everything from the hand-woven Persian rugs to the original artwork spoke of wealth that had been accumulated over generations. Not quickly earned, but it was also strangely impersonal. Despite having lived here for years, Marcus seemed to inhabit the space rather than truly live in it. There were no family photos, no personal mementos, nothing that gave any insight into who he was beyond his business achievements. "You seem restless," Marcus observed from his position by the piano, where he'd been playing a complex piece by Chopin with surprising skill. His fingers stilled on the keys as he turned toward where she stood by the windows. Elena had grown accustomed to the way he seemed to track her movements through sound and intuition rather than sight. It was unsettling at first, but she was beginning to appreciate the attentiveness it required. Marcus listened to everything, the way she breathed when she was thinking, the sound of her footsteps when she was pacing, the subtle changes in her voice when something bothered her. "I was thinking about my mother," Eleanor said, settling into the chair across from where he sat. It was the truth, though not the complete truth. She'd been thinking about her mother a lot lately, especially since moving into Marcus's world had given her access to resources she'd never had before. "You've mentioned her disappearance before. You were 12 when it happened." Elena nodded, then remembered he couldn't see the gesture. "Yes, she just left one day. There was a storm and she seemed agitated about something. She kissed me goodbye, said she'd be back soon, and then she was gone. The police said she'd probably just abandoned us, that it happened more often than people wanted to admit." Marcus's hands returned to the piano keys, but instead of resuming the Chopin, he played something softer, more melancholy. "But you never believed that?" "Never. My mother wasn't perfect, but she loved me. She wouldn't have left me with—" Eleanor trailed off, not wanting to revisit the difficult years that followed with her father's increasing drinking and anger. "With whom?" Marcus asked gently. "My father. He wasn't a good man after she disappeared. The drinking got worse and he took his anger out on anyone within reach." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, remembering nights spent hiding in her closet while her father raged about his wife's abandonment. He used to say she was a coward for running away, but I knew there had to be more to the story. Marcus stopped playing entirely, his attention focused completely on her. "What kind of work did your mother do?" "She was a journalist, freelance mostly. She did investigative pieces for smaller publications, often about corporate corruption or environmental issues. She was passionate about giving voice to people who didn't have power." Eleanor smiled sadly. "She used to say that the truth was the only thing that couldn't be bought or sold, only hidden or revealed." Something shifted. In Marcus's posture, a tension that hadn't been there moments before. Did she ever mention working on anything that might have been controversial? Anything that might have put her in danger? Elena looked at him more closely, noting the careful way he'd asked the question. "Why would you ask that?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting motionless on the piano keys. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. "Because I think there might be more to your mother's story than either of us realized." "What do you mean?" Marcus stood and walked to his desk, retrieving a thick folder that Eleanor hadn't noticed before. He returned to the piano bench, the folder heavy in his hands. "Rebecca has been doing some research, trying to understand the full scope of the investigations into my family's business practices. She found something that I think you need to see." Elena's heart began to race as Marcus handed her the folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, legal documents, and photographs that made her breath catch in her throat. There, in a photo dated just 3 months before her mother's disappearance, was her mother sitting across from an older man at what appeared to be a business lunch. The caption read, "Investigative journalist Maria Rodriguez meets with real estate developer William Blackwood to discuss alleged irregularities in recent land acquisitions." "That's your grandfather," Elena said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, William Blackwood was my grandfather, and according to these documents, your mother was investigating his business practices in the months before she disappeared." Elena's hands shook as she turned through the papers. There were copies of interviews, financial records, and what appeared to be evidence of fraudulent documentation related to land deals involving properties that had been acquired from indigenous communities and small farmers at well below market value. She was building a case against him, Elena breathed, pieces of a puzzle she'd never known existed beginning to fall into place. That's why she was agitated that night. She must have discovered something that made her afraid. Marcus moved to sit beside her on the sofa, his proximity offering comfort, even as his revelation turned her world upside down. There's more. The investigation your mother was conducting, it wasn't just about questionable business practices. She had uncovered evidence of document forgery, bribery of local officials, and systematic displacement of communities that had been living on land for generations. Elena stared at a photograph of her mother, looking younger and more determined than Elena remembered. In the photo, Maria Rodriguez was holding up documents and pointing to something off camera, her expression intense and focused. "How long have you known about this?" Elena asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. Marcus was quiet for so long that Elena began to wonder if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I suspected there might be a connection when Rebecca first mentioned your name. Rodriguez isn't an uncommon surname, but something about the timing felt significant. I had her do more research after our wedding." "After our wedding?" Elena turned to face him, anger beginning to build alongside her confusion. "You mean you've known for weeks that my mother was investigating your family, and you didn't think to mention it?" "I wasn't certain, and I didn't want to give you false hope or cause you unnecessary pain if I was wrong." Elena stood and walked. Back to the window, her mind racing. The view of Central Park that had seemed so peaceful moments before now felt like a cage. "What else aren't you telling me, Marcus? What other secrets are you keeping?" "There's something else," Marcus said, quietly. "Your mother didn't just disappear, Elena. According to these documents, she was scheduled to meet with federal investigators the week after she vanished. She was going to turn over everything she'd discovered about my grandfather's operations." The Sandu room seemed to spin around Elena as the implications hit her. "You think someone made her disappear to stop her from talking? I think your mother stumbled onto something much bigger than a few questionable land deals, and I think someone wanted to make sure she never had the chance to expose it." Elena sank back down onto the sofa, the weight of this revelation crushing. For 20 years, she'd wondered what had happened to her mother, had blamed herself for not being enough to make her want to stay. Now she was learning that her mother might have been silenced for trying to do the right thing. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. Marcus reached for her hand, his fingers warm against her cold skin. "Because you deserve to know the truth, and because I think we might be able to find out what really happened to her. Yes, my grandfather kept detailed records of everything. They're stored in a private facility upstate, files that were sealed after his passing. I have access to them, but I've never looked. I was afraid of what I might find." Marcus paused. "But if your mother was investigating his activities, there might be records of their interactions, maybe even correspondence that could shed light on what happened to her." Elena felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. "You'd do that? You'd help me find out what happened to her, even if it means uncovering more damaging information about your family?" "Elena, my grandfather's actions aren't my actions. If he was responsible for your mother's disappearance, then I want to know. That as much as you do. Maybe more." "Why more?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Because if my family is responsible for taking your mother from you, then I owe you more than just a business arrangement. I owe you justice." The sincerity in his voice made Elena's chest tighten with emotion she hadn't expected to feel. This man, who had married her for appearances, was willing to potentially destroy his own family's legacy to help her find the truth about her mother. "When can we look at the files?" she asked. "This weekend we'll drive up to the storage facility. It'll take time to go through everything, but if there are answers to be found, we'll find them." As Elena sat there, holding hands with her husband of 3 weeks. She realized that their marriage of convenience was becoming something much more complicated. The man she'd agreed to fake a relationship with was offering her something she'd never had before: the possibility of understanding what had really happened to the person she'd loved most in the world. But she also realized that whatever they discovered in those files would change everything between them for better or worse. The storage facility in upstate New York was a fortress of concrete and steel, housing the carefully catalogued secrets of some of America's wealthiest families. Elena followed Marcus through the climate-controlled corridors, their footsteps echoing in the sterile silence as they made their way to Unit 247, which contained 60 years of William Blackwood's business records. Marcus's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he entered the security codes, his heightened senses navigating the space with an ease that reminded Elena how much he'd adapted to his blindness. But she could sense his tension in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he moved, as if preparing for a blow. The unit itself was larger than Elena's old apartment, filled with filing cabinets, boxes, and what appeared to be a small office area complete with a desk and chairs. Everything was meticulously organized and labeled, testament to William Blackwood's attention to detail. "Where do we start?" Elena asked, feeling overwhelmed by the sheer volume of documents. "The dates," Marcus replied, moving toward a section of files labeled with years. "If your mother was investigating him in the months before her disappearance, there should be correspondence, meeting notes, maybe even recordings. My grandfather documented everything." They worked in companionable silence for hours, Elena reading aloud from files, while Marcus listened with the focused intensity she'd come to associate with his deepest concentration. Most of the documents were routine business correspondence, property deeds, and financial records. But as they moved into the files from the months before Maria Rodriguez's disappearance, a different picture began to emerge. "Marcus," Elena said quietly, her voice tight with emotion, "I found something." She held up a manila folder labeled Garcia Rodriguez Journalist Investigation. Inside were copies of emails, meeting transcripts, and what appeared to be a private investigator's report on Maria Rodriguez's activities and associations. Marcus moved to sit beside her as Elena began reading aloud. The documents painted a picture of a woman who had gotten too close to the truth. Maria Rodriguez had discovered not just questionable land deals, but evidence of a systematic pattern of corruption that involved bribing local officials, forging documents, and intimidating families into selling their property for fractions of its value. But the most damaging revelation was in the final document, a memo from William Blackwood to his business partner, dated just 2 days before Maria's disappearance. "The Rodriguez woman has become a significant liability," Elena read, her voice growing stronger despite the pain of the words. "She has documentation that could destroy everything we've built. James suggests we handle this the same way we handled the Thompson situation in 2003. I've authorized him to proceed." Elena's hands began to shake as she reached for another file labeled Thompson, 2003. Inside was a newspaper clipping about a local environmental activist named David Thompson, who had disappeared while investigating illegal dumping by Blackwood Industries. The case had gone cold after 6 months. "Elena," Marcus said softly, his hand finding hers, "I'm so sorry." But Elena was already reaching for another document, her journalistic instincts overriding her emotional response. What she found made her gasp audibly. It was a photograph dated 1 week after her mother's disappearance, showing Maria Rodriguez alive and apparently unharmed, standing outside what appeared to be a small house in a rural setting. "She didn't disappear," Elena whispered, staring at the photograph. "She was relocated." Marcus leaned closer, his fingers finding the edge of the photograph. "What do you mean?" "Look at this." Elena shuffled through more documents, finding a series of expense reports and wire transfers. "Your grandfather didn't have my mother. Eliminated. He had her relocated. There are payments here for housing, living expenses, even a new identity. Maria Rodriguez didn't abandon me, Marcus. She was forced into witness protection to keep her quiet." The revelation was both devastating and hopeful. Elena's mother hadn't chosen to leave her daughter, but she also hadn't been harmed. She was alive somewhere, living under a new name with a new identity. "There's more," Elena continued, her voice growing excited despite her emotional turmoil. "Bank records showing monthly payments continuing for years. Your grandfather was essentially paying her to stay hidden." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "The payments, are they still active?" Elena flipped through the bank records, tracing the pattern of transfers. "They stopped about 5 years ago, right around the time your grandfather passed away." "Which means she might not be in hiding anymore," Marcus said quietly. "If the payments stopped, she might have felt free to resurface." Elena felt a surge of hope, unlike anything she'd experienced in 20 years. Her mother was alive. Somewhere out there, Maria Rodriguez was living under a new name, possibly wondering what had happened to the daughter she'd been forced to leave behind. "We have to find her," Elena said, turning to face Marcus fully. "These records, they have to contain information about where she was relocated, what her new identity is. We can find her." Marcus nodded slowly. "We can try. But Elena, you need to understand what this means for my family, for me. This evidence doesn't just prove your mother was forced into hiding, it proves my grandfather was involved in systematic corruption that destroyed lives. If we pursue this, everything comes out." Elena studied his face, seeing the conflict there. "Are you having second thoughts?" "No," Marcus said, firmly. "But I wanted you to understand the choice I'm making. I'm choosing you, Elena. I'm choosing the truth over protecting my family's reputation." Something shifted between them in that moment, something that had been building since their first conversation in the cafe. This wasn't just about their marriage of convenience anymore. It was about justice, truth, and something deeper that neither of them had expected to find. "There's something else," Elena said, pulling out the final folder in the box. "Something that might explain why your grandfather kept such detailed records." Inside the folder was a single letter, handwritten and dated just months before William Blackwood's passing. It was addressed to Marcus. "Read it to me," Marcus said quietly. Elena cleared her throat and began, "Marcus, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and you have finally decided to confront the truth about our family's business practices. I know you've suspected for years that our success came at a price, and I know your blindness has given you insights into people's character that I wish I possessed." Elena paused, glancing at Marcus. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the tension in his jaw. "The Maria Rodriguez situation weighs heavily on my conscience. I convinced myself at the time that relocating her was kinder than the alternative my associates suggested, but I know now that forcing a mother to abandon her child was perhaps the cruelest option of all. I have continued to support her financially in hopes that someday I might find a way to reunite her with her daughter without destroying everything we built." Elena's voice broke slightly as she continued reading. "I failed in that goal, as I have failed in so many others. But perhaps you, with your moral clarity and strength of character, can succeed where I could not. The information you need to find Maria Rodriguez is in the sealed envelope attached to this letter. Use it wisely and know that I am proud of the man you have become despite my poor example." Elena reached into the folder and found the sealed envelope, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address in Oregon and the name Margaret Williams. "She's in Portland," Elena whispered. "My mother is alive and living in Portland under the name Margaret Williams." Marcus reached for Elena's hand, squeezing gently. "We'll go to Portland, we'll find her." "But first," Elena said, looking at the boxes of evidence surrounding them, "we need to decide what to do with all of this. Your grandfather may have had moments of conscience, but he still destroyed families and communities. These victims deserve justice too." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "You're right. We turn it all over to the federal investigators. Every document, every piece of evidence, we let the truth come out, whatever the consequences. Even if it destroys Blackwood Industries, even if it ruins your reputation." "Elena, I've spent my entire adult life trying to be better than my family's. Legacy. Maybe it's time I proved it by taking responsibility for their actions. Marcus stood and walked to the window of the storage unit, though Eleanor knew he couldn't see the landscape beyond. Besides, I'd rather be known as the man who exposed corruption than the man who covered it up. Eleanor felt something bloom in her chest, something warm and profound that she'd never expected to feel for the man she'd married as a business arrangement. This wasn't the cold, calculating businessman she'd met in that cafe. This was a man of integrity, willing to sacrifice everything for justice. 3 months later, Elena stood on the porch of a small house in Portland, Oregon, her heart pounding. As she raised her hand to knock, Marcus stood beside her, his presence a source of strength and comfort she'd come to depend on. The door opened to reveal a woman with graying hair and familiar brown eyes that widened in recognition and disbelief. "Elena?" the woman whispered, her voice carrying the same slight accent Elena remembered from her childhood. "Mom," Elena replied, tears streaming down her face as she stepped into her mother's arms for the first time in 20 years. The reunion was everything Elena had dreamed of, and more complicated than she'd imagined. Maria Rodriguez, now Margaret Williams, had spent 2 decades believing she'd never see her daughter again, convinced that trying to contact Elena would put them both in danger. She'd built a new life as a high school Spanish teacher, but had never stopped grieving for the daughter she'd been forced to leave behind. As they sat in Margaret's living room, sharing 20 years of stories, Eleanor learned that her mother had continued her investigative work in smaller ways, helping immigrant communities navigate legal challenges and exposing local corruption when she could do so safely. "I never stopped being your mother," Margaret said, holding Elena's hands tightly. "Every day I wondered what you were doing, if you were safe, if you'd grown up to be the strong woman I knew you could be." Elena glanced at Marcus, who had remained quietly supportive throughout the emotional reunion. "I had help," she said softly. "I found someone who believes in justice as much as you do." Marcus had been true to his word. Within weeks of their discovery, he had turned over all of William Blackwood's files to federal investigators. The scandal that followed was everything he'd feared and more. Blackwood Industries faced massive fines, dozens of families received compensation for land that had been fraudulently taken, and several former associates faced legal consequences for their actions. But something unexpected had happened in the aftermath. Instead of destroying Marcus's reputation, his decision to expose his family's crimes had earned him respect from unexpected quarters. Environmental groups, indigenous rights organizations, and investigative journalists had praised his courage in choosing truth over self-preservation. The marriage of convenience had evolved into something neither Eleanor nor Marcus had anticipated. Their shared commitment to justice, their growing understanding of each other's strengths and vulnerabilities, and the deep respect that had developed between them had created a foundation for something real. 6 months after their reunion with Elena's mother, Marcus and Elena stood together in the same courthouse where they'd first married, but this time surrounded by friends and family. Margaret stood as Elena's matron of honor, tears of joy streaming down her face as she watched her daughter marry for love rather than necessity. "Do you, Elena Rodriguez Blackwood, take Marcus to be your husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" the judge asked. "I do," Elena said, her voice strong and clear as she looked into Marcus's unseeing but somehow all-seeing eyes. "And do you, Marcus Blackwood, take Elena to be your wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the same quiet strength that had first attracted Elena to him. As they exchanged rings, real rings this time, chosen together rather than hastily purchased for appearances, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. They had started as strangers entering a business arrangement, but they had become partners in every sense of the word. Marcus had used his resources to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting investigative journalism and protecting whistleblowers. Eleanor had returned to her work as a translator, but now she also served as the foundation's director, using her skills to help expose corruption and support those who had been victimized by powerful interests. Together, they had built something that neither of them could have achieved alone, a relationship based on mutual respect, shared values, and love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings. As they walked out of the courthouse as husband and wife for the second time, Elena's mother beside them and Rebecca throwing rice with tears in her eyes, Marcus leaned close to Elena's ear. "No regrets?" he asked softly. Elena smiled, thinking of the desperate woman who had agreed to marry a stranger for money and the man who had been willing to sacrifice everything for justice. "Not a single one," she replied. Their story had begun with deception and desperation, but it had become something beautiful and true. They had found love in the most unexpected place, and in doing so, they had discovered that sometimes the best things in life come from taking the biggest risks. Film da Historia. Dear listeners, we hope that Elena and Marcus's incredible journey has touched your hearts as much as it touched ours. This story of love born from the most unlikely circumstances, of justice prevailing over corruption, and of family reunited after decades apart, reminds us that truth and love can triumph even in the darkest situations. Their transformation from strangers bound by a contract to partners united by love and purpose shows us that sometimes our greatest challenges can lead to our most beautiful discoveries. If this story of redemption, courage, and unexpected love has moved you, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Share your thoughts about Elena and Marcus's journey, or tell us about a time when taking a risk led to something wonderful in your own life. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the complexity of human relationships and the power of love to overcome even the most difficult circumstances. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads, and give this video a thumbs up if Elena and Marcus's story touched your heart. We bring you new stories every day that celebrate the triumph of love, justice, and human connection. Thank you.